The motor programming theory is an aspect of how we still do view or are viewing the central nervous system. And this sort of came in, I think, the middle of last century as a theory of how we move. And it's looking at what we call motor programs. So one of the best examples, motor program, is when you move based on the movement is produced by the interconnection of many neurons, both in the spinal cord and the brain stem. And you connect these neurons, you learn movement, you learn motor patterns, or motor programs. You're not born with motor programs. So the classic one is learning to drive, for example, right? If you're born in this side of the world, you learn to drive on the right side of the road. And so the skill of learning to drive is about creating a motor program for driving, right? It's modified by sensory inputs, right? So go to Australia, drive on the other side of the road, put what you think is the indicator on, and actually be reaching out the window. Sensory input, or putting on the windscreen wipers. Okay, that's not what I want. Sensory input, I can change my motor program. Right? And a huge part of our locomotion is based on learned motor programs. You know that in the sense that you can recognize someone, you can recognize your friend walking down the corridor maybe before you can see them by the way they walk. But it's the systems control theory that we really do hang our hat on in terms of how the central nervous system creates movement. And I'm going to not speak so much to the words, but go to a couple of pictures. So systems control is the interaction of action and perception and cognition. Systems control is saying that there is both a hierarchical and a parallel processing that goes on all the time. So incoming sensory information will be processed at many levels of the central nervous system at once. That's parallel processing. Right? Then there's a hierarchical component in that the varying levels of the central nervous system can communicate and modulate each other. Right? But I think a really important point here is to say that movement is produced through this interrelationship of perception, cognition, and action. This is another schematic picture of systems control. And obviously, yeah. So you have down here the spinal cord, right? The spinal cord has many, many interneurons within it. And those interneurons, that's the basis of where some of the reflexive, or where the reflexive pathways exist, and where the rhythmical circuitry, both in the spinal cord and the brain stem, exist. You have the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, and they, as we've said, have these loops with the cortex. So there's a lot of communication between the cerebellum, basal ganglia, and the cortex through a subcortical structure of the thalamus. And they provide feedback in terms of the evolution of a movement. The cerebellum can also then communicate to these black lines, which are the descending systems, right? The direct corticospinal, as well as the indirect cortex to brainstem, brainstem spinal cord. And there's a number of those pathways, cortico-reticulospinal and cortico-rubrospinal being two of the more commonly known. And the cerebellum can influence the information coming down through these cortex, brainstem, brainstem, spinal cord pathways. So there's many areas of the central nervous system here that you actually have to take in terms of the production of movement. This is essentially the same picture, but in a diagrammatic form. And what I want to point out here is, as therapists, how can we influence movement? We can influence movement by afferent input, whether that, of which much of the afferent input is the consequence of a movement performed. So as therapists, how can we get into this picture and influence the output? Right? The answer is really that essentially we are walking forms of afferent input. Right? We need to consider, therefore, how we use what is afferent input. Afferent input is voice. Afferent input is cutaneous, right? Skin, receptors in the skin. Afferent input is somatosensation, muscle spindle, Golgi tendon organ receptors. Right? We need to consider and be very precise in terms of how we use that afferent input to influence the output. Because that afferent input will rise from a spinal cord to cerebellum tracts, spinal cord to brainstem, and spinal cord via the thalamus to the cortex. So the afferent input of Golgi tendon, muscle spindle, cutaneous rises to many components of the central nervous system to influence the processing that occurs in terms of the next movement. Right? So how a patient stands over a leg, whether they're in some hip flexion or not, whether their hip extensors are long and weak, whether they're behind the foot or able to come onto the foot and the load received through the foot, all those things will influence the picture of muscle activation for stance phase. But we have to be really precise in terms of how we prescribe that afferent input. So therefore, some of the clinical messages to answer those initial questions. Normal movement is carried out automatically and depends on this continuous flow of visual, somatosensation and postural input. So therefore, as therapists, when I said, what are the tools that you use to influence movement, if you don't at the moment consider vision, somatosensation and posture as part of the tools, then you're missing a lot of the richness of how you can change movement. Right? Because that's what influences how we produce movement. Yes, we can direct and tell someone to move a certain way, but that's only one way of changing movement. And saying really the same message, that the simplest action, so no matter how simple the motor performance is, even just to stay standing, if you might think that's simple, right, requires this integration of sensory, motor and motivational pathways. The second clinical message was that question in terms of if you had a view that a muscle is turned on by one part of the cortex and turned on in isolation, right? And so, in fact, that never happens. Even moving, even just wiggling your toe, right, or just moving your ankle, or just moving your knee, even only moving one joint, is never occurs as the result of only putting one muscle on. For any part to move discretely, there's got to be postural stability elsewhere to allow that discrete movement. Right? There's also got to be more than one muscle to allow for that activity. So to pick my ankle up, yes, I've got to go for concentric tib-ant, but I've also got to have the lengthening in the posterior structures. So cortical motor control involves much more than activation of individual muscles. And so therefore, when you're treating a patient and you're working to strengthen, you may be goal-orientated to change a particular muscle or group of